We had a word for the end of things. Not the dramatic kind, not explosions, not the death scream of a collapsing star, not the silence after a fleet goes dark. Those we had words for. Those we understood. We had filed them, categorized them, built monuments to them across 14 systems and 3,000 years of careful, documented history. I mean the other kind of ending. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that arrives wearing something else's face, wearing the face of a soldier with mud on her boots and a piece of wire she pulled from a dead communications relay, asking if anyone had tape. Tape. We were on day 41 of the Menvari siege. 41 days of coordinated orbital bombardment, of tunnel collapses, of casualty projections so clean and certain that our Strategic Council had already begun drafting the terms of conditional withdrawal. The math was not ambiguous. It never is. You reach a point in any campaign where the numbers stop being estimates and start being facts, and the only rational response is to begin the paperwork. The humans had been on the ground for 11 days. I should tell you what that means. I should explain the siege lines, the atmospheric interference, the supply disruption, all the careful, professional reasons why 11 days was already 6 days longer than any sane Allied force would have remained. I should give you the mission briefing the way I gave it to my superiors, measured, clinical, appropriately grim. But that is not what happened. What happened is that I was watching from the orbital relay station when Sergeant Adiz Okafor climbed out of a collapsed trench on day 37, covered in something I did not want to identify, carrying 3 wounded soldiers that were not human, that were not even from her unit, that she had no tactical reason to carry, and she was singing. Not loudly. Not heroically. Just singing. And I remember thinking, with the particular clarity that only comes at the exact moment before a framework collapses entirely, I do not have a category for this. I still don't. That's the thing about humans that none of the briefings prepare you for. The war's horror, the bombardments, the casualties, the siege math, that was nothing. We had language for horror. We had protocols for it, monuments to it, therapists trained specifically in the management of it. What we did not have, what we had never needed, in 3,000 years of careful, documented history, was a category for whatever humans are doing instead. This is my attempt to build one. I am not sure I will succeed. I'm not sure it matters. My name is Velsarith, 3rd Intelligence Officer of the Conclave Orbital Command, and I have a confession that would likely end my career if my superiors ever read this log. I have been keeping a secondary record. Not the official one, the operational transcript that goes to command every 18 hours, sanitized of uncertainty and stripped of anything that might suggest I have begun to personally identify with the subjects of my observation. That record is clean. Professional. It says things like Human Contingent Alpha demonstrates non-standard tactical flexibility in contested tunnel sector and Sergeant Okafor, displays effective improvisational resource management under fire. Improvisational resource management. That is what I wrote when she used a torn piece of her own uniform, a segment of copper wire, and what I can only describe as aggressive optimism to patch a comms relay that our engineers had classified as unrecoverable. When I transmitted that report, Logistics Commander Taithvara sent back a single-line acknowledgement and moved on. He did not ask what aggressive optimism meant in material terms. I chose not to explain. This, the record I am keeping now, in the margins of my official logs, in a notation format that technically classifies as personal memoranda and, therefore falls outside standard review, this is where I am trying to understand what I am actually watching. Because after 38 days of this siege and 11 days of watching the human unit operate inside it, I have accumulated a category problem that no amount of clean professional language is successfully resolving. Let me start at the beginning. The real beginning. Not the war had a beginning, and it was bureaucratic and depressing and involved 3 competing territorial claims and a treaty violation that every senior diplomat on both sides now privately agrees was probably an accident. I don't care about the war's beginning. The war's beginning is documented in 17 volumes and available in the Conclave's public archive, and it will tell you everything about resource margins and geopolitical tension and the specific, predictable way that rational species with competing interests eventually stop being rational. I care about day 30. Day 30 of the siege. Day 1 of the humans. I remember the manifest arriving in my queue the way mildly irritating administrative details tend to arrive at an inconvenient time, with insufficient context, attached to a requisition I had not submitted. 112 personnel. Human. Attached to the Joint Allied Support Effort under an emergency authorization from the Conclave's 5th Expeditionary Compact, which meant someone several levels above my pay grade had made a decision I was now responsible for monitoring. I read the manifest twice. I filed a clarification request. Standard procedure. The clarification request came back stamped approved observation only, which told me almost nothing except that someone wanted a record of whatever happened next. Then, I looked at the operational briefing they'd been given. The humans had been handed the Keble Corridor. Sector 9. The tunnel network that connected the eastern siege line to the civilian underground shelter complex, which the Minbari forces had collapsed, mined, partially flooded, and booby-trapped across approximately 4 kilometers of narrow subterranean passage, through which our allied engineering teams had already attempted 3 separate breach operations, all failed, all resulting in casualties, all classified in the operational record as tactically inadvisable without significant resource escalation. I remember thinking, they have given the humans the assignment we have already decided is impossible. I remember thinking, this is either a test or an apology. I was not sure which was worse. The first thing I noticed, and I have thought about this, because the order of noticing turns out to matter, was not the tactics. It was the sound. I was monitoring the corridor feeds from the orbital relay, which gives me audio as well as visual, and the humans had been in the tunnel system for approximately 40 minutes before I heard it. A low, rhythmic sound. Repetitive. Almost musical, except not quite. More like the audio equivalent of something a species might do with their mouths when their hands were occupied and their minds were somewhere slightly outside the present moment. Humming. The lead element was humming. The lead element, Sergeant Okafor, whom I had identified from the manifest as the human unit's primary forward operative, 11 years of service, 7 documented engagements, 3 commendations for actions I had not yet fully read, was moving through a partially flooded, mine-seated, sniper-covered 4-kilometer tunnel system, and she was humming. I checked the audio calibration. The calibration was fine. I noted this in the secondary log. I filed it under behavioral anomaly, low priority. I will freely admit, wrong about the priority. What followed over the next 6 hours was something that I am still, weeks later, not fully able to reconcile with my training in tactical observation. I have watched Allied forces conduct tunnel clearance operations before. I know what they look like. They look like careful, methodical, terrifying work performed by specialists with comprehensive equipment and well-established protocols, and they look like that because the alternative, performing tunnel clearance without comprehensive equipment and well-established protocols, produces casualty rates that the Conclave Strategic Council has formally classified as operationally unsustainable. The humans did not have comprehensive equipment. They had the equipment they'd been issued, which was standard, and then, approximately 3 times as much other equipment, which was not standard and which had been sourced, as far as I could determine from the manifest, from a combination of personal gear, salvaged from destroyed Conclave vehicles in the staging area, and what I can only describe as creative requisition, which is a phrase I am using to avoid the more accurate phrase, which is they took things that were not theirs because they needed them and no one was watching closely enough to stop them. The sergeant, specifically, had acquired the following items that were not on her issued manifest: 2 additional detonation caps, 1 medical-grade tissue adhesive intended for field surgery, a handheld spectral scanner originally assigned to an engineering team that had been evacuated 3 days prior, 1 thermal blanket of Conclave manufacture, and a ceramic mug. The mug, I would later learn, was personal property. She had brought it from the transport. It said something on the side in her species' written language. I had it translated. It said, "Don't talk to me until this is empty." I have thought about that mug more than I expected to. The mine was the first thing. Not the first mine, the first moment I understood that I was watching something categorically different from the tactical behavior my training had prepared me to observe. Standard mine clearance protocol, as practiced by all 12 Conclave member species with documented tunnel warfare capability, involves a combination of remote sensing, careful physical probe, and, when time constraints require, controlled detonation from maximum safe standoff distance. The standoff distance is calculated based on blast radius, fragmentation pattern, and the structural integrity of the surrounding tunnel. The math is precise. The math exists because a very large number of people died to produce the data that generated the math, and that sacrifice is honored by applying the math correctly every time. Okafor did not apply the math. She applied what I can only describe as the opposite of the math. She identified a pressure-triggered anti-personnel device buried in the tunnel floor, identified it using the salvaged spectral scanner, which she was carrying one-handed while crouched behind a support strut, talking quietly into her comms in a tone I would characterize as aggressively unconcerned, and then she moved toward it. Not to probe it. Not to disarm it in the conventional sense. She looked at it for approximately 4 seconds. She made a sound that I did not have a translation for, a short, exhaled sound, somewhere between acknowledgement and dismissal. And then, she reached into a pouch on her kit, removed a small metal tool that my database identified as a device for gripping and turning mechanical fasteners, and she disarmed the mine manually. With her hands. In approximately 40 seconds. While still talking quietly on the comms. The soldier behind her, a younger human whose name I didn't yet know, asked, apparently in a tone that suggested this was a normal question, Series 4 or 5? 4, said Okafor. Series 5s have a secondary pressure plate. Keep your feet wide. Copy. They moved on. I sat with the feed for a long moment after they moved on. Then, I went to the mine database and found the technical specifications for a Series 4 Menvari anti-personnel device, which confirmed that manual disarmament without specialized EOD equipment was classified as, I am quoting directly, viable only if the operator has detailed prior exposure to this specific mine variant and accepts a significant probability of device activation during disarmament procedure. I noted the phrase significant probability. I noted the phrase accepts. I sat with those two words for a while. There is a concept in Velhari strategic doctrine, my people, my training, called Velthorin. It translates, imperfectly, as something like the informed choice to accept inevitable cost. It is the calculus of sacrifice, the recognition that some objectives require losses, and that a rational commander authorizes those losses with clear eyes and documented reasoning, and the understanding that the cost is known and weighed and found to be worth the paying. Velthorin is considered the highest form of military judgment. We have ceremonies for commanders who perform it correctly. We have their names on walls. Okafor did not perform Velthorin. What Okafor did was not a calculated acceptance of known risk. The risk was not known, or rather, it was known to me, reading the database in the orbital relay, and it was apparently also known to her, and it was not the same kind of knowing. She knew and proceeded anyway, and the proceeding was not sacrifice logic, it was not the cold arithmetic of the objective is worth the loss. It was something else. Something more like, I keep coming back to this, something more like I have done this before, and I am still here, and those two facts together constitute a plan. I do not have a word for that in Velhari. I checked. I asked the translation database to find the closest conceptual match across all catalogued conclave languages for proceeding with confidence derived from prior survival rather than prior data. It returned 0 results. 0. 3,000 years of catalogued language across 12 spacefaring civilizations, and not one of us had needed a word for that. By hour 4, the human unit had cleared 270 meters of mine tunnel, bypassed a section that had been partially flooded by a collapsed drainage pipe by rigging a temporary traverse out of cable and the thermal blanket and what I believe was someone's boot, and located a secondary access route that our engineering teams had not identified in 3 previous surveys. They located it because Okafor stopped in the middle of the tunnel, went very still, and said, "Does anyone else smell that?" The Velhari do not have a sense of smell in the human sense. We have chemical receptors, but they are calibrated for atmospheric hazard detection gases, toxins, particulate threats. We do not use them for navigation. We do not use them to find things. The humans, apparently, do. The secondary access route smelled, according to the subsequent report I received from her junior communications officer, a human named Ferreira, who was keeping more detailed notes than I expected and who I was increasingly grateful for. Of stale air and old concrete and something that might be the other side. He had noted this in his log with a casualness that suggested this was not remarkable to him. The other side. They followed the smell of old concrete for 60 meters and found a maintenance bypass that shaved a full kilometer off their route and avoided the most heavily mined section of the central corridor entirely. The engineering teams had missed it on 3 surveys. Okafor found it by stopping and breathing. I did not note this in the official log. I noted it here, in the secondary record, in the margins. I wrote, olfactory navigation. Catalog for follow-up. Then, I sat back and looked at the ceiling of the relay station and became aware, in a way that was entirely new and not entirely comfortable, that I was monitoring a species I did not understand with the tools designed for species I did. That was the gap. That was always going to be the gap. I just hadn't known it was there until that moment in the tunnel, when a woman stopped humming long enough to smell a wall and find the door. They reached the shelter complex at hour 6. The complex held approximately 900 civilians, Velhari, drawn, 2 species I will not name because their governments would prefer their presence in the shelter complex remain undocumented, who had been cut off for 22 days. 22 days with limited supplies, failing atmospheric processors, and no confirmed status on the siege above them. The first human through the tunnel access hatch was not Okafor. It was Ferreira, young, shorter than most of the unit, carrying a medical pack that was visibly too large for him and had been patched in 3 places with what appeared to be the same tissue adhesive Okafor used for the mine components, which I chose not to think about too hard. He came through the hatch, and 900 civilians who had been in the dark for 22 days looked at him. He looked back. And then, he said, in a voice that my audio feed rendered with complete fidelity, "Hey. Sorry it took so long. We're going to get you out. Is anyone hurt?" That was it. That was the entrance. Sorry it took so long. Is anyone hurt? Not a tactical assessment. Not a status query in the standard conclave emergency contact protocol. Not the formal identification and verification sequence that I knew by rote and that any of the 12 conclave member species would have performed because it is the correct procedure and procedures exist for good reasons. Sorry it took so long. There was a Velhari child, I could see her on the feed, small, the pale gray-green of a young Velhari in a low-light environment, which meant her photoreceptors had been running on minimum nutrition for too long, who was standing near the back of the crowd, and, when Ferreira said those 5 words, she made a sound. Just a sound. Not a word. The kind of sound that happens when something inside a body that has been held very tight for a long time loses its grip on itself. Ferreira crossed the chamber in 4 steps and crouched down to the child's eye level and said something too quiet for my audio to catch. Then, he opened the medical pack and started working with the brisk, competent efficiency of someone who was entirely used to this, to people who had been holding themselves together for too long, to the particular kind of collapse that happens when something arrives that finally makes collapsing feel safe. I noted a fault in one of my chemical receptors around this time. A calibration error, I assumed. Producing a trace reading for something that wasn't present in the relay station's atmosphere. I ran the diagnostic twice. The readings persisted. I made a note to have the equipment serviced. Then, I kept watching. On day 41 of the siege, I received a priority communique from command that used the phrase preliminary strategic reassessment 4 times in 6 paragraphs. That is the conclave's way of saying, we were wrong about something, and we would prefer to not specify what. I wrote a response acknowledging receipt. I used the phrase noted with interest twice. This is my way of saying, yes, I know, I've been watching it happen for 11 days, thank you for catching up. I did not send that response. I sent the professional one. But, I kept the draft. It's in the secondary log. Somewhere between the entry about Okafor disarming the Series 4 mine and the entry I wrote at approximately the 3rd hour of day 38, which I have titled in the personal notation format that my superiors will never see, the singing. I will get to the singing. But it requires context, and the context requires that I first explain what happened in the shelter complex over the 47 hours following the initial breach. Because that is where the category problem stopped being an intellectual curiosity and started being something that was affecting the readings on my chemical receptor array with suspicious regularity. The shelter complex, once accessible, presented a logistics problem of moderate to significant complexity. 912 civilians. Failing atmospheric processors running at approximately 40% capacity. 2 medical emergencies, 1 Velhari elder in respiratory distress, 1 drawn juvenile with a secondary infection from a wound sustained during the original siege collapse. Limited food and water. And, above them, on the surface, an active siege in which the Allied lines were holding but not advancing, which meant that the corridor the humans had just cleared was the only viable evacuation route, and that route had to remain passable for the duration of what would necessarily be a multi-stage movement of nearly 1,000 non-combatants through 4 kilometers of damaged tunnel. The Conclave has protocols for this. We have good protocols. They are detailed and they have been developed across centuries of exactly this kind of situation, and they work when applied correctly by trained personnel with appropriate resources. The humans applied approximately 40% of the protocols and improvised the rest. I say improvised because that is the technically accurate word. I want to be precise about this, I am not using it as a compliment. Improvisation carries risk. Improvisation introduces variance into situations that require control. Every deviation from established procedure is a point at which something can go wrong in a way that the procedure was designed to prevent. I knew this. I know this. I watched anyway, because I was the assigned observer and because watching was my function, and because, and I will be honest about this in the secondary log even if nowhere else I had not yet been able to stop. Okafor organized the evacuation in 4 groups. Standard enough. What was not standard was the assignment logic. She grouped people not by mobility status or species or any of the factors the Conclave protocol would prioritize, but by what I can only describe as social cohesion. Families together. Individuals who had clearly formed relationships during 22 days of confinement together. The Velhari elder with the respiratory distress was placed in a group that included 3 other Velhari adults who, according to a note Ferreira made in his log, know her and will keep her moving without it feeling like being moved. Without it feeling like being moved. I have read a great deal of evacuation literature. I have not previously encountered that as an operational parameter. It worked. It worked better than the protocol would have, and I spent approximately 2 hours after the evacuation concluded trying to understand exactly why, and what I arrived at was something uncomfortable. The humans had factored in something the protocol didn't have a field for. Not capability. Not status. Not resource cost. Dignity. They had organized 900 people to move through a dangerous tunnel in a way that preserved each person's sense of being treated as a person rather than a unit to be relocated. And it had been faster. Not just kinder faster. The groups cohered. They kept pace. The elder with respiratory distress walked the full 4 kilometers with her people around her and arrived at the Allied staging area under her own power, because being carried would have been humiliating and the humans had apparently known that without being told. I have no protocol language for this. I tried to write it into the official report. The closest I got was human-optimized social grouping methodology demonstrated measurable efficiency gains versus standard evacuation sequencing. That sentence is technically accurate and completely wrong, and I left it in the report because I did not have better words, and I have been bothered by that ever since. Okafor slept for 4 hours on the tunnel floor. Not in the staging area. Not in the shelter complex, which by then had been largely vacated. In the tunnel. Approximately halfway through, in a section wide enough to sit against the wall, during what the operational record describes as downtime between evacuation phases. I saw it on the feed. She sat down with her back against the tunnel wall, closed her eyes, and was asleep in what I estimated at under 2 minutes. Her rifle was across her knees. There was a drawn soldier in the tunnel, one of the Allied support personnel who had been assigned to assist with the evacuation, who had come around the corner and stopped at the sight of her. He stood there for a moment. I know the Drawn well enough to read their posture. This one was doing the Drawn equivalent of I do not know what to do with this information. The Drawn do not sleep in unsecured environments. The Drawn, as a species, require confirmed perimeter establishment and atmospheric certification before any rest state is physiologically possible. This is not a choice or a cultural preference, it is their neurology. They cannot sleep where they do not feel safe. The tunnel was not safe. The tunnel was, technically, still a partially mined active combat corridor, secured but not cleared, with the siege still active above them. Okafor was asleep in it like she'd done this 100 times. Like safety was something you carried with you, not something you waited to arrive. The Drawn soldier stood there for almost a full minute. I watched him watching her. Then, he sat down against the opposite wall, not quite close enough to be presumptuous, and I watched him try to recalibrate something his neurology had told him was impossible. He did not sleep. He was incapable of it. But he sat there anyway, in the not-quite-safe tunnel, next to the sleeping human, for the remainder of her 4 hours, and, when she woke up and registered him and said, "You didn't have to stay," he said, very formally, in translated Drawn, "I was not certain what you were doing was wise. I wanted to observe the outcome." Okafor looked at him for a moment. "Smart," she said. Then, she stood up, slung the rifle, and kept moving. I noted this exchange in the secondary log under a heading I created for it. I called the heading Transmission. I did not explain further. I think I already knew, by that point, that explanation was not the part that mattered. Day 37. The singing. The second evacuation group had encountered a complication. A section of tunnel that had been partially restabilized by the human unit's engineers had developed a fresh stress fracture in the ceiling, and the decision had been made to hold the group in place for approximately 90 minutes while the lead engineers assessed the structural risk. Standard. The group was safe. The hold was precautionary. But it was 90 minutes in a dark tunnel with 900 people who had already spent 22 days in the dark. I watched the feeds and I could see in the Velhari among the group, specifically, whose photoreceptors I was calibrated for, the specific biological signs of what my species calls Velkef. The darkening that happens when the rational assessment of a situation tips from manageable into I am no longer certain this ends. Not panic. Worse than panic, in some ways. Panic is energetic. Velkef is the color that comes after panic's energy is spent. Okafor was in the group. She had been cycling between groups, moving with each phase. I had assumed she would do what a conclave field officer would do in this situation: broadcast a status update, enumerate the precautionary nature of the delay, provide timeline certainty. Reassure through information. It is what we are trained to do because information reduces uncertainty and uncertainty is the mechanism of Velkef. She did something different. She found a spot near the center of the group, where she could be heard, and she started to sing. I have the audio. I have listened to it several times, in the secondary logs audio archive, which I am aware is unusual for an intelligence officer of my rank and function. The song was, I will describe it accurately, low. Not soft exactly, but low. The kind of low that resonates in enclosed spaces. A repeated melodic phrase that cycled and, varied and, then, returned, something like a question and its own answer, over and over. In a language I didn't recognize from her file, which turned out, per my subsequent query, to be a language from a region of her planet called West Africa, and the song was very old, old enough that the original context was documented in anthropological records rather than contemporary usage. It was not a tactical asset. It was not communications. It had no information content relevant to the evacuation. The Velhari children went still first. They have acute hearing, children, and something in the low register of the sound intersected with, I don't have the precise term, the particular register of comfort. Of being held at a distance. The adults followed, not because they understood the words, because they didn't, but because the sound had a shape that was doing something language doesn't do. Something older than language. The Velkef slowed. The photoreceptors lightened. The tunnel did not become safe. The siege did not end. The ceiling still had a stress fracture in it. Okafor kept singing, and none of those things changed, and none of those things mattered the way I expected them to, because somehow the question of whether things were safe had been briefly separated from the question of whether things were bearable, and the second question had been answered in a way that made the first one slightly less urgent. She sang for 47 minutes. Then, the engineers gave the all-clear and the group moved, and she stopped singing and picked up her rifle and moved to the front and never mentioned it again. Ferreira noted in his log, "Sarge did the thing." That was the full entry. Sarge did the thing. I have thought about the compression in that sentence. About what it means that he had a name for it, the thing that required no further description, that was apparently a known quantity, a repeatable event, something she did and the people around her had learned to expect. The thing. As if it were an item on a list. As if it were a tool she carried along with the tissue adhesive and the spectral scanner and the ceramic mug. I added it to my list of things for which I had no Velhari word. The list is getting long. The evacuation completed on the morning of day 38. 912 civilians. No fatalities during the extraction. 2 medical cases transferred to the Allied medical station, the elder and the infected juvenile, both stable. The corridor was held open for 17 hours and then, the human unit's engineers collapsed it behind them, controlled demolition, planned from the beginning, cutting off the Minbari access to the civilian shelter network. The official report describes this as successful completion of Objective Keval 9. It is accurate. It is also approximately the same as describing a piece of music as successful sequential production of notes. I submitted the official report. I flagged the operation as high-value case study for Joint Allied Tactical Review. I used every careful phrase I had developed over 11 days of watching and translating and failing to translate. Then, I sat alone in the relay station and I looked at the feed from the staging area, where the human unit was resting, truly resting, this time, not the tactical 4-hour tunnel sleep but the post-operation collapse that I recognized as biologically similar to the Velhari Thesa, the period following sustained adrenaline activity when the body reclaims what it's owed. Okafor was sitting on a supply crate. She had the ceramic mug. Someone in Ferreira, I think, had apparently found working heating equipment in the staging area, because there was steam rising from the mug, and she was holding it in both hands, and her eyes were closed, and her face had the particular stillness of a person who has allowed themselves, at last, to stop. She looked tired. Not the dramatic tired of the feeds. Not even the specific tired of 11 days in an active combat corridor. Just tired. The ordinary kind. The kind that is allowed to exist after the work is done. I am aware that I spent several minutes watching this. I am aware that this is not what orbital relay feeds are for. I noted both of these facts in the secondary log and moved on. What I did not write down, because I was not sure how to write it, was the thing that was happening in my thoracic cavity, that resonant shift in the gas exchange organ that registers, for Velhari, as something between pressure and warmth, something the medical literature describes as a response to Velera, to witnessing the correct completion of a difficult thing. Velera. The satisfaction of rightness. I had felt it, across my career, when a tactical plan resolved correctly. When a negotiation succeeded. When a complex piece of intelligence yielded the outcome it was designed to yield. I had not expected to feel it watching a human hold a mug. But she had carried those people 4 kilometers through the dark and she had sung them through the part that could have broken them and she had brought 912 people out of a place where they had stopped believing they were coming out, and now she was sitting on a crate with her eyes closed, and the thing was done. That was Velera. That was exactly Velera. And I noticed, in noting it, that she did not know I was watching. That she was not performing this for anyone. That the stillness was entirely private, a person settling into the fact of having done what she came to do, without an audience, without acknowledgement, without any apparent need for either. I added that to the list too. Not a category. Not a label. Just witnessed. Filing for later. Command sent a follow-up communique on day 42 requesting detailed behavioral annotations on the human unit for potential integration into joint operation planning frameworks. I spent 3 hours on the response. What I wanted to write was, "You cannot integrate this. That is not an insult. It is a classification problem. You cannot write a protocol for the thing that operates before the protocol becomes necessary. You cannot put the singing in a planning framework. You cannot requisition the drawn soldier's decision to sit in an unsecured tunnel for 4 hours next to someone sleeping like they had never been prey. These are not techniques. They are not assets. They are what happens when a species spends a very long time in very difficult conditions and comes out the other side not having decided that difficulty is an argument against trying. What I actually wrote was, human unit demonstrates consistent high performance under non-standard operational parameters. Recommend extended joint operation study period with detailed tactical documentation. Both things are true. Only one of them fits in a communique. I keep the other one here. I met Okafor in person on day 44. Not as an observer. Not via feed. In the staging area, at the edge of the field kitchen that some enterprising person had established against every relevant regulation in the Joint Operation Handbook, because the Joint Operation Handbook assumed that Allied forces would maintain species-appropriate separate catering arrangements to avoid cross-contamination incidents, and someone had apparently decided that the relevant regulation was more of a suggestion after the tunnel operation. I had come down from the orbital relay for a scheduled in-person debrief with the Allied command staff. The debrief had gone exactly as long as it needed to and no longer, and I was walking through the staging area when I encountered the field kitchen, and the field kitchen smelled of something I did not have a referent for, and I stopped. The smell was not a hazard. I checked. It was complex, thermal-modified organic compounds, plant-derived oils, something sharp that registered on my chemical receptors as borderline irritant, and it was coming from a container that Okafor was holding over a compact heating element with the focused attention of a person performing a task they genuinely cared about. She looked up. I was in full intelligence officer insignia, which among Valhari functions as a clear social signal. Most people look at the insignia and, then, look slightly elsewhere, which is the appropriate response. Okafor looked at the insignia, then, at me, and her expression did not change in the ways I had learned to expect. "You're the relay observer," she said. Not a question. I confirmed this. "Figured," she said. "You want to sit?" I had a return transport scheduled. I sat anyway. She went back to the container, which turned out to be human food, prepared using several items that had been, I would later verify, technically requisitioned from an emergency supply stock that did not include anything classified as an ingredient. She had made food out of non-food. This was, I was beginning to understand, typical. "You can ask," she said, still looking at the container. I said, "Ask what?" "Whatever it is." She adjusted something with a piece of folded material that I recognized as a section of the same thermal blanket she'd used in the tunnel. "You've been in that relay station for 44 days. You've been watching us for 11. You came down for a debrief that ended an hour ago. You're still here." I considered several responses. I selected the honest one. I am trying to understand something and I am having difficulty finding the correct framework. She made the sound, the short exhaled sound I had first heard in the tunnel, over the mine. The acknowledgement dismissal. What's the something? I sat with that for a moment. "You sang," I said. "In the tunnel. On day 37. During the hold. You sang to 900 people for 47 minutes and it changed what was happening to them, and it had no tactical value, and you never mentioned it in any report, and Ferreira described it in his log in 3 words. I have been trying to write it into the operational record for 6 days and I cannot find language that captures what it was." She was quiet for a moment. "What language are you trying?" "Conclave Standard. All 12 registered frameworks." I queried the military anthropology database as well. She made a different sound. Not the acknowledgement dismissal. Something lower. I did not have a translation. "It wasn't a thing," she said finally. "It's just, people needed something. I had something. I gave it." She looked at the container. "That's not complicated. It is, I said, demonstrably, extremely complicated. For who? I sat with that. For the frameworks, I said. She looked at me then, properly, for the first time. The way she'd looked at the mind 4 seconds, very still, reading something. I think, she said, carefully, that might be a problem with the frameworks. There is a thing that happens, in my species, when a statement reorganizes something that has been in the wrong position for a long time. It is not a dramatic thing. It does not announce itself. It is more like the slight shift in equilibrium when you put down a weight you had forgotten you were carrying, and, for a moment you do not know what to do with the arms that are no longer full. She said, I think that might be a problem with the frameworks. I had been treating this as an observation problem. A classification problem. A language problem. 11 days of watching and, noting and, querying and, annotating, trying to find the right place to put what I was seeing, the right label that would make it fit inside the existing architecture of everything the conclave knew about how species behave. She had not done that. She had looked at 900 people in the dark and skipped the classification entirely and gone straight to, they need something, I have something, I give it. No framework. No protocol. No prior categorization of whether the 900 people were worth the 47 minutes, whether the singing was an appropriate use of operational downtime, whether the strategic value of civilian morale justified the resource expenditure of one combat soldier's voice in one section of one tunnel and one siege that the conclave had, 6 days prior, been quietly preparing to withdraw from. She had just given it. I thought about the 912 people in the staging area. I thought about the drawn soldier sitting in the tunnel for 4 hours because he had decided to observe the outcome of a thing he wasn't sure was wise. I thought about Ferreira crouching to eye level with a Velhari child and saying sorry it took so long. I thought about Velthorin. The highest form of Velhari military judgment, the informed choice to accept inevitable cost. The sacrifice made with clear eyes and documented reasoning. I thought about how none of what I had watched over 11 days resembled Velthorin. Velthorin required the cost to be inevitable. Velthorin was for situations where the math had already run and the loss was already confirmed and the only remaining question was whether you accepted it with dignity. The humans did not appear to accept any cost as inevitable until it had actually arrived, and sometimes not even then. The mine was not inevitable. The flooded section was not an impassable obstacle. The 900 people in the dark were not a loss to be grieved, they were a problem to be solved with wire and old songs and a woman who had decided, apparently, that her being there was sufficient argument against giving up. Velthorin was the word for after the math is decided. The humans were doing something before the math. Something the math could not incorporate because the math was built on the assumption that every variable could be fixed, every probability could be calculated, every situation could be assessed for its likely outcome before the attempt was made. The humans were operating in the space where you make the outcome first and figure out the probability later. I had no word for this. I still don't. The siege broke on day 49. Not through a decisive military action. Not through the orbital bombardment that command had been recalculating for 2 weeks. Not through the tactical genius of any senior officer on either side. The Manvari forwarded fleet, which had been maintaining the siege from 3 anchored positions above the atmospheric envelope, discovered on day 46 that their ground supply lines had been compromised. Infiltrated. Disrupted in a pattern that was, this is the exact phrase from the intelligence summary I received, characterized by repeated small-scale actions targeting logistics nodes rather than combat units, conducted with apparent disregard for engagement risk. Apparent disregard for engagement risk. The human unit. Not just Okafor's element, the full contingent of 112 had been split across the siege perimeter after the Kebel corridor operation, embedded with allied ground units, and they had been, I am quoting the Manvari post-engagement tactical analysis that we obtained through standard intelligence channels several weeks later, operating in a manner inconsistent with documented alliance tactical doctrine, targeting infrastructure with a persistence that did not respond to casualty pressure in expected ways. Did not respond to casualty pressure in expected ways. They had taken losses. I knew this. 4 dead in the Kebel operation, 7 more across the subsequent 3 weeks. I had their names in my records. I had noted each casualty in the official log and, in the secondary log and, in both places felt the notation as a weight. The Menvari analysts had expected the losses to produce a specific response, the standard tactical recalibration that any rational force performs when a campaign's cost exceeds its initial projections. You reassess. You contract. You protect what you have and stop attempting to gain what the math now says is too expensive. The humans had contracted slightly and then continued. They had lost people and regrouped and gone back to the same nodes by different routes. The Menvari had destroyed a tunnel access and the humans had found a surface approach. The Menvari had reinforced a node and the humans had gone around it to the next one. The Menvari had established a response protocol for small-scale infiltration and the humans had changed their pattern before the protocol was fully implemented. Not because they were faster. Not because they were smarter in any categorical sense. Because they had apparently decided, at some level that I could not locate in any of the official planning documents, at some level that might not have been explicitly decided at all but simply assumed, the way you assume the ground will hold your weight, that the campaign was not over until it was over. Did not respond to casualty pressure in expected ways. On day 46, the Menvari forwarding fleet began a repositioning sequence. On day 49, the siege was functionally concluded. The Allied command staff held a briefing which I attended in person, in which the phrase unexpected campaign termination was used, which is conclave speak for, we are not entirely sure how this happened. I am sure. I have 11 days of secondary log explaining exactly how this happened. I chose not to share the secondary log with the briefing. I found Okafor in the hours after the official termination announcement. She was at the field kitchen again. She had the mug again. She was not alone, Ferreira was there, and 2 other humans I had catalogued from the unit, and a drawn soldier I recognized as the one from the tunnel, and a Velhari engineer who had been attached to the corridor operation and who was, based on his posture, attempting to determine whether it was appropriate for him to be there. It was apparently appropriate. No one told him otherwise. I stood at the edge of this for a moment. Okafor saw me. She nodded at an empty section of the supply crate she was sitting on. I sat. The conversation around me continued without particular adjustment to my presence, which I found notable and, then, found myself not wanting to analyze because analyzing it felt like the wrong response to being included. Someone handed me something, a container, warm, and I did not know what it contained but I accepted it because declining would have required an explanation I did not currently want to construct. It contained a liquid that was hot. Complex. Slightly bitter. Nothing my species typically consumed. I held it. Ferreira said something to Okafor about a report he'd filed. She made a short sound at him that I had learned was affectionate correction. The drawn soldier said something, formally, about the outcome of the campaign. The Velhari engineer said something about the tunnel engineering specs. Okafor said something back. The conversation moved the way conversations move when the people having it are not trying to do anything with it except exist in the same space for a while. I held the container. The liquid cooled to the point where my chemical receptors registered it as safe to attempt, and I attempted it, and it was something I did not have a category for. Not pleasant in the way that Velhari nutritional compounds were pleasant. Not unpleasant either. Something else. Something that seemed to register differently when you knew it had been made by someone, for a specific occasion, in a place that was not built for making things. I drank it. No one commented. The field kitchen smelled of the same complex organic compounds. The drawn soldier was telling a story about the tunnel, about the 4 hours he had sat in the not quite safe dark, and, in the telling the story had become slightly funny, the way stories about frightening things sometimes become when the frightening thing is sufficiently over. Okafor laughed at the right moment. Ferreira laughed a second later, which is the laugh of someone who has heard the punchline before and still finds it worth the response. I did not laugh. I do not have the mechanism. But there was something in my thoracic cavity again. The Vel-era pressure. The resonance of something correctly completed. I sat there until the light shifted and the field kitchen began to wind down, and I was aware at some point, not with alarm, just with the particular noticing that happens when a fact settles into place, that I had missed my return transport by approximately 40 minutes. I did not flag this as an operational concern. I have been writing this account for 3 weeks, in the secondary log, in the notation format that my superiors will never see, and I think I have arrived at the end of what I can explain. The war did not end because of the humans. I want to be precise about that. The siege broke because of a combination of factors that any competent strategic analyst could catalog: supply disruption, allied ground pressure, Minbari resource limitations, political considerations on both sides that I was not fully cleared to observe. These factors existed with or without the human contingent. The math was already shifting. The humans made it shift faster. That is documented. That is in the official record. But that is not what I am writing this about. I am writing this about the framework problem. The category problem. The specific, persistent way that 11 days of observation had left me with a list of things I had witnessed and could not classify, and what it meant that the list kept growing, and what it means that I have been unable to stop adding to it for 3 weeks. I have added the mine, and the smell in the tunnel, and the sleeping on the tunnel floor, and the organizing of 900 people by who would keep each other moving, and the 47 minutes of singing, and the continued operations despite casualty pressure that the Minbari had calculated would produce retreat, and the field kitchen that should not have existed, and the liquid I drank that I still do not have a name for, and the drawn soldier sitting in the dark, and the Valhari child making a sound when she heard sorry it took so long. I have added the fact that Okafor, on every feed I have of her for 11 days, in every situation I have observed, appears to operate from a premise that is not written anywhere in any conclave planning document, not formalized anywhere, not declared. The premise appears to be, everyone here is worth the effort. Not because of their value to the operation. Not because of their species classification or their strategic utility or their projected survivability. All of them. The 900 civilians and the injured Drawn and the Valhari child and the soldier behind her in the tunnel asking about Series 4 mines and the Drawn who sat in the dark because he wasn't sure what he was watching but he wanted to see the outcome. All of them. As a default. Not as a calculation. I do not know how to integrate this into a planning framework. I do not know how to write it in official language. I have been trying for 3 weeks and the best I have is, the human contingent demonstrated consistent high performance under non-standard parameters. Which is true and insufficient and will go into the tactical review and be noted and filed and contribute to whatever the conclave's next approach to joint operations looks like, and it will not say anything about why. I know why. I just can't make the language hold it. There is one more thing. A final entry. On my last day in the staging area, before the orbital relay position was stood down and the joint operation formally concluded, I went to return the container. The one from the field kitchen. I had kept it, I will not explain why, it is not relevant to the operational record, and I brought it back to the supply area where the field kitchen had been, now mostly disassembled. Ferreira was there, packing equipment. I handed him the container. He looked at it. Then, at me. Then, at the container again, with an expression I had learned, over 44 days, to read as, "This is slightly funny but, I am not going to say so." "You kept it," he said. "It seemed like the appropriate behavior," I said. "Returning borrowed items." "Sure," he said, and took it. He turned it over in his hands. "You know, she makes it different every time. The recipe's not written down anywhere. She just makes it. Without a record," I said. "Yeah. How does she know how to replicate it?" He looked at me with an expression I could now read, over 44 days, quite clearly. "She doesn't," he said. "That's kind of the point." I stood there. Every time is just what she had, that time. What the situation needed. She doesn't try to make it the same. She makes it right for the moment and, then, it's done. He put the container in the pack. "It's always good, though," he said. "Somehow it's always good." He finished packing and left, and I stood in the empty space where the field kitchen had been, and I looked at my hands, and I thought about the list. The mine and, the smell and, the sleeping and, the singing and, all the rest of it. She doesn't try to make it the same. She makes it right for the moment. I had been trying, for weeks, to find the repeatable principle. The transferable doctrine. The thing I could extract from 11 days of observation and compress into language that the conclave could use going forward, the framework that would let us understand the humans in a way that made sense. There was no framework. That was the answer I had been circling for weeks, and it landed there in the empty kitchen space with the particular finality of a thing that cannot be unfound. They do not have a framework. They have the moment. They have what is needed right now, assembled from what is available right now, held together with wire and thermal blankets and old songs and the baseline assumption that everyone present is worth the effort. And, somehow it is always good. I do not have a word for this. I do not think I need one. I think the list is the word.